Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I'm John Brooke. I'm the chair of the Ohio Center for Historical Research program in Crisis and Uncertainty, and we're in our second and final year. Welcome all today, here and virtually. Let me make a few announcements before I welcome our guest of honor. First, we have two final lectures in our series, and registrations are open. Next week, we have Adia Benton from Northwestern talking about pandemic potential. And on the 14th of April, Professor Ling Zhang from History at BC, who will be talking about China and her life experience in China. 70 meters below is my home, geotrauma, and earthly memories of East China. Both these are hybrid events over in the Research Commons in the 18th Avenue Library. Hope you can join us. Next autumn, we will start our next program, which is Anger in History, running through 2025 and led by Bruno Cabanas and his steering committee and our director, Sarah Budler. Details are already up on the website. So let me take a second to thank the Mershon Center for being a co-sponsor of the event today, and Dory Noyes, their director, and a long-term member of our steering committee. The Department of History and our chair, Scott Levi, a long-term and trusted supporter of the CHR. And I want to thank for technical support today, Laura Seeger of the Goldberg Center, Luke Harrison of ASC Tech, and special thanks to Shannon Niemeyer, who is no longer here, of OSU Libraries for welcoming us again to this wonderful space. Let me move on. It is my distinct pleasure and great honor to welcome Professor Ned Foley to our series. Professor Foley has taught in the Ohio State Moritz School of Law since 1991, and where he holds the Emerson Chair in Constitutional Law and directs the Election Law Project. He earned his law degree at the Columbia University School of Law, clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals, and for Justice Harry Blackmun in the Supreme Court. And in 1999, served as the state solicitor for the Ohio Attorney General, handling appellate and constitutional cases. Now, he has written on a wide variety of election law issues, including the need for nonpartisan institutions in electoral administration, including, among other highlights, has in 2014 writing for the American Law Institute's Project for Election Administration with Professor Steve Huffner, Principles of Law, Non-Precinct Voting, and Resolution Ballot Counting Disputes. He's the author of two books that combine legal analysis, historical arc, and popular accessibility, a rare and very telling combination. Ballot Battles, the history of disputed elections in the United States, put out by Oxford in 2016, explores the history of contested elections from the era of the founders to Bush v. Gore and beyond, getting the finalist for the Langham Prize in American Legal History. Presidential elections and majority rule, the rise and demise and potential restoration of the Jeffersonian Electoral College, published by Oxford in 2020. Examines the history of the Electoral College from the founding to the present, and proposes a model for the reform of state laws that would enable the Electoral College to operate as intended by the reforms of 1803, the 12th Amendment, precluding the election of presidents who failed to reach popular majorities from taking office. His most recent labor is a second edition of Election Law Litigation, a casebook of election law, which must have been a lot of work. Now, his extensive online commentary about gerrymandering has appeared in a number of sites, including Election Law Blog, and he has obviously been cited in a number of gerrymandering cases that come before the Supreme Court. You might have caught him speaking on NPR and MSNBC, or read his extended commentary on the last presidential election in the Washington Post. Now, we are here in this series considering crisis uncertainty, qualities that have shaped Ned's presentation here today in more ways than one. Clearly, we've been living on the edge of constitutional crisis and election dysfunction for a number of years, decades now. Professor Foley has been a voice of reason as we attempt to achieve the ideal of majority rule realized in free and fair elections in a constitutional structure, cobbled together, compromise after compromise, by a few dozen white men in a few hot months in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The Constitution, fixed in the years following in the interest of maintaining union of free and slave states, small and large states, should have been restructured long since. But we are saddled with an unrepresentative Senate, state control of federal elections, and the archaic Electoral College, and the governance of the United States by a minority, potentially, leaving us, as Lincoln said in 1861, either in anarchy or despotism. Professor Foley will have a lot more to say about this today. But as of last October, neither of us were really exactly sure what he was planning to say. And he was extremely elusive all autumn as he bobbed and weaved as I feebly attempted to extract the title and an abstract for this presentation from his clutches. But the election was upon us, uncertainty was in the air, and crisis seemed to loom. And I knew that he would come through. So after the election, he popped up with his plans, and the title of his paper today is before us. So we welcome his thoughts this winter now that we have some political certainty and a brief respite from looming electoral and constitutional crisis.
That was that was great and the perfect introduction, because John, thank you. That was exactly right. We talked a lot about what today's talk, and I like the metaphor of weaving and bobbing in terms of uncertainty. And first of all, it's an honor to be here. You know, I've been in the audience in this great room, you know, so often. I don't believe I've actually stood at the podium in this room. So thank you for the opportunity to do that. So one of the reasons why I hesitated so long in giving you a title and the theme was because in October, before the midterm elections of last November, you know, one of the things that I was worried about, many of you were worried about, the public at large and other people who focus on elections, was this idea of election denialism. You know, a number of politicians over the last couple of years repudiating or refusing to acknowledge the accuracy and the legitimacy of authentic results, you know, demonstrable through genuine audits and recounts and so forth. We had a real fear headed into the midterms last November, you know, that denialism would prevail. And, you know, that threat still exists, but thankfully it is somewhat diminished. That particular crisis, we have to be vigilant on, but I am glad that I turned to this other more structural crisis that maybe is looming or upon us, but isn't quite as evident as the risk of denialism, which was so front and center. Let me just say one more word about denialism before turning to the main theme today. You know, for those of you who study American political history, the figure Richard Hofstadter will be very meaningful. And he wrote an influential book called The Paranoid Style of American Politics that was a response to the McCarthy era and the Red Scare of the 1950s. And my own analogy for the phenomenon of election denialism that kind of came in American politics, you know, with the 2020 presidential election and the events of January 6, 2021, and then the threat of it in the midterm, it felt to me like a form of electoral McCarthyism. In other words, what Hofstadter was talking about the public becoming gripped with a fear, paranoid style that wasn't based in reality because charismatic politicians were, you know, stoking that fear, seeing, you know, very much a repeat of this phenomenon that Hofstadter talked about is happening, you know, with the Salem witch trials and with the Know Nothing movement. And those of you who study American history know that this is a recurring phenomenon. And so election denialism, you know, was an aspect of that recurrence. But thankfully, you know, the McCarthyism itself, the Red Scare version of it, that bubble burst, took 4 years, but the Army McCarthy hearings have you no shame, sir. You know, I don't know if we had quite the same vivid moment that has caused election denialism to recede from the scene. And, maybe we won't know that we're really through this version of it until 2024. But hopefully it will be episodic in the way these other paranoid moments have been. But the theme for today is something that is much more deep and basic and not episodic. It is the, structures that we use to operate popular sovereignty and democracy in America. And the structural flaws have been with us really from the beginning, and we've struggled from time to time to try to improve them, and we've made some improvements. But we have, as John said, aspects of our electoral system built into our overall constitution that prevent us from translating preferences into authentic results that truly represent the will of the voters. So that even if you take away the risk of denialism, even if everybody involved says we count ballots accurately, we give people ballots, they cast them, we count them, the institutional mechanisms from taking those preferences and yielding office holders has structural defects. So that is the focus for today. So I think many of you have seen this iconic image. This is the original gerrymander, Elbridge Gerry, I think is how you pronounce it, governor of Massachusetts, in, what was it, 1812 or 1814. I'm using this image because it is located in the cover of a pamphlet written in 1872, hard for you to see that, by a guy named William Robert Ware, who actually was an architect and a professor of architecture at MIT in the 19th century, but dabbled in electoral reform. And we will come back to Ware. So the point is, there was the original gerrymandering. People were worried about it, throughout the 19th century into the 20th century. We continue to worry about it. It is that deep-seated a problem. Just to put it in contemporary perspective, the flaw of gerrymandering is increasingly problematic in terms of its deviation from the vision of why we have representation to begin with. So we have gerrymandering of state legislatures, but this graph or chart is meant to show the increasing uncompetitiveness of congressional seats as a result of redistricting. And if you think about it, going back to those founders in Philadelphia in 1787, they wanted the House of Representatives to be the most responsive institution of the government, right? House of Representatives elected every 2 years, the only one to be popularly elected by the citizenry. The Senate was appointed by state legislatures. The Electoral College was this very complicated contraption that doesn't necessarily involve any popular vote component to it, because state legislatures could appoint electors directly, as many of them did at the beginning. So the House of Representatives was the one institution that was supposed to change with the changing mood of the public. And yet it is the least responsive institution we have today because of the way in which we allocate seats. So it is a big structural issue. In case you thought that gerrymandering was a problem of the previous decade and not the current decade, the midterms were affected by gerrymandering. Democrats do it as well as Republicans. This is the Democratic Party's gerrymander of the Illinois congressional map. And again, you can look at the squiggly lines. They may not be exactly the same shape as Elbridge Gerry's original salamander-shaped gerrymander, but some pretty contorted districts designed to give maximum political power to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party may have gotten overly greedy. They tried to gerrymander in New York as well as in Illinois. The New York gerrymander was struck down under state constitutional law by the highest court in New York. And if they'd been just a little bit less greedy, the House of Representatives was so close. People debate about this. Democrats might have retained control of the House had they not been quite so aggressive in New York. So it is maybe a little bit playing with fire. But anyway, in any event, we in Ohio know gerrymandering all too well. We, as citizens, tried to rid ourselves of this phenomenon with these ballot measures that we adopted to try to undo the gerrymandering of previous decades. It was an utter fiasco. If you followed the news in Ohio at all, you understood that 5 times the Ohio Supreme Court invalidated maps, and 5 times the politicians responded and said, no, we're sticking with our maps, and it sort of a terrible breakdown in our system, and really kind of is embarrassing for us in Ohio and throughout the nation. Interestingly enough, just this week, Governor DeWine said it's time to take redistricting away from elected officials. He was a participant in this very ugly process, but and interesting to figure to watch throughout the process. But now that the process is behind him, and maybe he's thinking about legacy, and you welcome conversion whenever it comes, and so if he is now on record saying we desperately need reform, hallelujah, I would say, for the benefit of the people, in a nonpartisan way. And the theme that he's mentioning that comes out of this recent interview is, again, take, if you let politicians be in charge of the process, they are going to be self-interested and abusive of it. You need to come up with a scheme that takes it away from the politicians. Well, believe it or not, I've got a proposal to do just that. This is a law review article in the works that's going to be published by the Kentucky Law Review, and it's a alternative way to do districting, which I call self-districting, which would let voters pick their own districts. It would liberate congressional seats or state legislature seats from completely from geographical consideration. There'd be a component of geography. For those, again, history-minded folks, we've always kind of done a representation in the United States based on, physical geography. We inherited this from Britain and so forth. But, there are other ways to represent citizens in legislatures, and Europe has done much more experimenting with proportional representation schemes that are not really geographical based. I think we have enough of a tradition that thinks the geography is an important component that we shouldn't try to abandon it entirely. And I won't go into the details today of how self-districting would have some role for geographies, but some role for individual voters to define what's most salient to them in terms of dimensions of representation, whether it's their occupation or their age cohort or their other attributes of personal or social identity. If any of you are interested in Q&A, we could, talk about the details of that. Because while I started today's talk by identifying gerrymander as a huge structural flaw to the issue of American representation and getting accurate representation that reflects the true will of the people in government, it's not the only one. And in some ways, I think it's not the one that's most deserving of focus, because seats, elected positions that are not susceptible to gerrymandering still have a fundamental problem of unrepresentativeness. And so that's what I want to turn to. So these are the results from last year's midterm for statewide, 2 of the statewide races here in Ohio, the U.S. Senate race and the governor's race. And again, the key point about these races is they're not susceptible to gerrymandering, right? You can't district the governor's office and you can't district the U.S. Senate position. And yet there is a kind of a structural flaw in how we ask Ohioans to vote for these offices and put people into office. And again, this is a nonpartisan point, as I hope you'll see through the examples and illustrations that I'm going to show you. The key feature to note here is the difference in these 2 results. So yes, the Republican candidate wins both, but by significantly different margins. There's almost a 10-point gap between, DeWine's victory over his opponent versus J.D. Vance's victory over Tim Ryan, right? So 53-47 compared to 62.5, 37.5, right? If every voter voted purely based on, red versus blue, those results shouldn't differentiate. And so that difference is important. What it sort of signal, there's no doubt, somebody who's followed both Ohio politics and national politics over the last 30 years, Ohio is, undoubtedly shifted. We used to be the proverbial nice edge, swing state, pivotal state like we were in the 2004 presidential election. We are undoubtedly trending redward, if that's the right way to put it. Missouri did that before us. Iowa has done that. I mean, politics, shifts in important ways, as historians know. But the point here is that even if, Ohio is more red-leaning than it used to be, there's a difference between, deep red, or what we might call MAGA red, the Trump wing of the Republican Party, versus the more traditional Chamber of Commerce, business-oriented type Republican Party. And so, even though Ohioans would vote for a MAGA candidate like J.D. Vance, what we're seeing here is they might actually prefer a non-MAGA Republican. DeWine, as an incumbent, managed to get through his primary, but there was an open primary for the seat that Rob Portman, a non-MAGA Republican, vacated, and a MAGA candidate won the primary. There was a non-MAGA alternative, Matt Dolan, who finished third. But the point is, what happens in the primary is not the same as the general election, and so voters in November don't have, in Ohio, in the Senate race, don't have that non-MAGA option. They only have a MAGA option and a Democrat, and they go MAGA, but the governor's race showed that had they had a non-MAGA Republican option, they might have liked that even better, even though that didn't make it through the primary. This is not a phenomenon that is unique to Ohio. This is happening all around the country, and it's increasingly so, and it really is important. I'm going to focus for the next few minutes on, politics, electoral politics today, and then we're going to take a look back into the history of how we got here and what do we do about it. But I just want you to sense the urgency of the structural problem that we face today, so that we then go back and figure out how do we get to this point and how might we address it. So all around the country, we're really seeing, formally we still have just two political parties, red and blue, but in fact there is a three-way split, maybe a four-way split, but what is really emerging last year was a three-way split in the electorate. So Arizona governor's race, Carrie Lake, the MAGA type Republican, she was the leading election denialist probably of them all. Maybe the one running for governor in Pennsylvania, Mastriano, is another one. I gather Lake just lost an appeal yesterday in the Arizona Court of Appeals. She's still at it. She's going to the Arizona Supreme Court claiming that she was denied her own victory. I mean, it's all nonsense. This is a version. She is the ongoing version of electoral McCarthyism out in Arizona. But she won the Republican primary against a non-MAGA traditional and business-oriented Republican named Karen Taylor Robeson, quite close. And that left the general election being, again, Democrat, versus MAGA was the choice in November. It was a close race, actually. Had it been, GOP, if Taylor Robeson had been the Republican nominee, that November seat might have gone to the Republicans. Another example of this was the Pennsylvania race for the U.S. Senate, which got a lot of attention. Dr. Oz was the Trump-endorsed MAGA candidate who won very narrowly the Republican primary against a guy named David McCormick, who came out of the Wall Street business-oriented wing of the Republican Party. That was so close it went to a recount for several weeks before Oz prevailed. Most Republican operatives think that had McCormick been the nominee, McCormick would have beat Fetterman. But Fetterman, beats MAGA in the general election. Down in North Carolina, similar thing. Ted Budd was one of the original denialists who was part of the contingent in the U.S. House of Representatives that objected to Biden's electoral votes on behalf of Trump. So he gets Trump's endorsement for the U.S. Senate. He runs the Republican primary against a former governor, Pat McCrory, who is the non-MAGA alternative. Bud wins, and then he goes on to win his seat, kind of like J.D. Vance does. In more red-leaning states, the MAGA victor from the primary can go on and win the general election. In a bluer state like Pennsylvania or even Arizona, the Democrat is likely to beat the MAGA candidate in November, but doesn't mean that's the one that the voters as a whole would most have preferred. In fact, we're going to look at the New Hampshire U.S. Senate seat, which is a similar situation. This guy, Don Bolduc, was another aggressive election denialist. He beats the president of the New Hampshire Senate, a guy named Chuck Morse. Again, very close. Chuck Morse is definitely the more traditionalist Republican. Can't make it out of the primary. Bolduc loses to Maggie Hassan, the incumbent. Out in Alaska, you may have followed this. Alaska's got this new electoral system with ranked choice voting that we'll talk about. And Sarah Palin was running with Trump's endorsement as the MAGA candidate. Mary Patola was the Democrat, and the more traditional GOP candidate was a guy named Nick Begich. And there was an interesting three-way split, first for a special election to fill the vacant seat, and then again in November. So the theme here is all around the country, we're seeing this kind of three-way split in the electorate, and our institutions, our systems really can't handle it. And I think, again, we can show this in a number of ways. I think the New Hampshire race illustrates this most vividly, because here again is very stark, ticket splitting, so to speak. Again, even in an era of polarization that we'll talk about, if everybody voted lockstep in a partisan way, you couldn't see this divergence. But again, in the Senate race, the Democrat, Maggie Hassan, beats the MAGA denialist 53.5 to 44.5. You go over to the governor's race and you see a very non-MAGA Republican, Chris Sununu, who may run for president, trying to say that there's a lane for the non-MAGA Republicans in presidential politics. Who knows? But anyway, he distanced himself from Trump. He distanced himself from denialism. He distanced himself from Bolduc. In fact, he endorsed Chuck Morse as the non-MAGA Republican in the U.S. Senate race, hoping his status as incumbent governor would kind of carry Morse through the primary. Didn't work, but Sununu handily wins 41.5, his own race for governor. So I want to move into the realm of hypotheticals a little bit, because we have to think counterfactually about what would happen if we had a different electoral system that perhaps could capture more accurately the missing middle, if you will, that's getting squeezed out. Some people talk about the center squeeze of our electoral system. So one way to think about this is to imagine that New Hampshire Senate race had taken place with the kind of ranked choice voting ballots that now Alaska is using. So we'll talk a little bit about what a ranked choice ballot looks like and how it might operate, but hopefully this example can help illustrate that. So let's pretend that instead of having partisan primaries, which haven't been part of the original design, right? The founders in Philadelphia didn't talk about party primaries. That's an innovation to deal with the advent of parties that we'll talk about. But so let's imagine that had an electoral system that would handle this three-way split in the electorate somewhat differently. So instead of Morse and Bolduc having to compete in a Republican primary between the MAGA and the non-MAGA win, put them on the same ballot with the Democrat, see what happens. So let's just, this is a hypothetical, but hopefully it's useful for purposes of illustration. Given the ticket splitting that actually occurred in the November race, we can see that there's a gap, right? I mean, we can, there was 42% of the electorate was definitely going to vote for a Democrat in either election. So, that's a solid assumption that in a ranked choice ballot situation, they would vote for the Democrat first, and then their preference would be the less extreme Republican. They don't want any Republican, but if, in terms of just the rational ordering of a ranked ballot, they would say, okay, I prefer Morse to crazy election denialist Bolduc if I'm ranking choices that way. And then if you allow Morse to be in this three-way race, let's just sort of assume that he would capture that, swing cohort of voters who, voted for Hassan against Bolduc, but voted for Sununu against the Democrat. And so if the Sununu and Morse represent that more moderate, traditional, business-oriented, non-denialist, non-MAGA Republican Party, we can sort of attribute 12% of the ballots or the electorate would prefer Morse the most if they had that option. But then they go to the Democrat and they like Bolduc the last. Now, there's going to be a hardcore far-right, part of the electorate that is with Bolduc all the way, and they hate the Democrats, so that's their last choice. Morse would be their second choice as kind of a rhino-type Republican. But then Bolduc is going to pick up a significant percentage of people who would prefer the traditional Republican, but again, if he's not an option, remember the Republican primary was actually quite close between these two. So there were people who voted for Bolduc in the general election who would have voted for Morse first had it been a genuine three-way race. And so I'm imagining, based on the figures of the primary and doing my best to kind of reconstruct the preferences of the electorate, again, 15% of the voters, Morse first, reluctantly a denialist Republican second before they go to a Democrat. So that's kind of what a ranked choice ballot looks like. How would a ranked choice election actually work? Well, the way it operates in Alaska and the state of Maine, most places, both here in the United States, around the world that use it, it's what many of us call instant runoff voting, because it tries to emulate a runoff between, the two strongest candidates measured by first place preferences. So the methodology is to knock out the candidate with the fewest overall first place votes. In that case, again, Morse, right? Even though you put him in the mix in a three-way race, he's the one who's going to get knocked out initially because his first choice total is only 27 based on this example. So you knock him out. And what the mathematics of instant runoff voting does is it looks who is second on each of the ballots that favored Morse first and redistributes those ballots to whoever is listed second. So Hassan picks up the cohort where she's ranked second, the 12% cohort, and Bolduc picks up the other cohort where he is ranked second, Bolduc, on the ones that ranked Morse first. So that's the kind of distribution that occurs. And what happens? Basically, instant runoff voting replicates the result of the system that we currently have, right? It reproduces the Hassan Bolduc election without Morse in the race, giving us the same results. But that is not the only way to conduct a ranked choice election. Again, remember, I'm going to get to history here. There is a important history lesson to talk about, but I just want you to think about in terms of what we should do for the sake of democracy in America, the United States. How do we get representation? You can take the exact same preferences on ranked ballots and construct what I like to call a round-robin election, because any of you who are familiar with the idea of a round-robin tournament in sports, a round robin is where every competitor has a match against every other competitor. So A versus B, A versus C, B versus C, and you compute who wins each of those head-to-head competitions. And if there's a competitor who wins all of their matches, they're the winners of the round robin. So how do we take ranked ballots and construct a round robin tournament out of them? Let me show you. You take each pair of candidates and see how they fare against each other on every ballot. So you ignore, if we're doing the head-to-head of Morse versus Hassan, we ignore Bolduc at the moment and compare where Hassan ranks versus Morse on every ballot in the election. We see Morse ranks ahead of Hassan on a whole bunch of ballots for a total of 58%, including the ones that most preferred Bolduc, but we ignore him for the moment. Morse is still ahead of Hassan, so Morse wins that head-to-head, 58-42. Okay, what about Morse versus Bolduc as a head-to-head? There we ignore Hassan, and we say who's ahead on the ballots, and now Morse is ahead of Bolduc on even more ballots, because all the ones who preferred Hassan the most like Morse better than Bolduc, and so Morse beats Bolduc by a whopping 69-31. The third head-to-head is the one that we actually got, or the New Hampshire actually got in November, Hassan versus Bolduc. Ignoring Morse, we see Hassan beats Bolduc. But Morse is the round-robin winner because he beats either competitor head-to-head, right? There's that missing middle of the electorate forming coalitions in such a way that the more centrist candidate, when measured against one on the right and one on the left, actually has more support. They get majority support from different coalitions of majorities, but the middle candidate wins the round robin. Now, we might want to think about this here in Ohio, and so this is an example, again, hypothetical example based on the lessons of the midterms and look into the future, right? If we think about what is roughly the Ohio electorate that we learned about from last term, we've got a good 40% of Ohio is definitely MAGA first, reluctantly traditional GOP, Rob Portman, Matt Dolman type second, Democrat third. We've got a 40% of the electorate who's definitely Democrats, does not want any Republican, but would prefer a Matt Dolan to J.D. Vance. We've got, a pretty strong cohort of Rob Portman type supporters who, as they showed us, they'll vote for J.D. Vance over a Democrat if that's their choice, but their first choice would be a Portman or a Dolan. And then there's probably a sliver of Ohio's electorate that that they would prefer Dolan, and they would actually cross party lines and vote for a Tim Ryan before they would vote to a J.D. Vance. So if we think about, what's an electoral institution that would be, good for the state of Ohio under current conditions looking forward, again, we could think about using the instant runoff method that Alaska and Maine is using, New York City's now using, a bunch of cities are using. But what's it going to do? It's going to do pretty something that we just saw with the New Hampshire example. It's going to knock out the Portman, Matt Dolan types as having the fewest first place choices. It's going to do the kind of repositioning that we just saw. It's going to redistribute the ballots, and it's going to replicate MAGA over Democrat victory that J.D. Vance wins over Tim Ryan. On the other hand, if you take those same ranked choice ballots and you apply the round robin methodology, you get a different result. Now, I want to show you a different version of the round robin methodology. This is something called the total vote runoff approach that I've developed with a Harvard economist mathematician named Eric Maskin. We ended up publishing an op-ed in the Washington Post together, kind of explaining this system, because it would have handled the Alaska race that I mentioned differently than the instant runoff method. The moderate Republican Nick Begich would have won the total runoff calculation I'm about to show you. Mary Patola, the Democrat, won the instant runoff. So, it matters which calculation you use. The total vote runoff method will always achieve, if there is a round robin winner of the kind that I showed you, a candidate beats everybody else in the round robin, that candidate will also win the total vote runoff. Eric and other mathematicians can prove that point algebraically, a little bit beyond my math skills, but the proof is there. The key point for why you might want to think about the total vote runoff method is it's operationally identical to the instant runoff method that I just showed you, except for how it defines the candidate who deserves to be eliminated in the runoff process. Regular instant runoff, like Alaska uses, defines the weakest candidate as the one with the weakest first place votes. Total vote runoff says, wait a second, there's a lot of information on these ballots besides who's a first choice. We can compute total votes for each candidate off of all the information from the ballot. How do we do that? And if we think about that round robin analogy, a first place vote on a ballot is a vote against the other two candidates. So there's like two votes. The power of being in first means you have two votes for that candidate against the other two opponents. If you're in second place, you get one vote because you're ahead of one other candidate. If you're in last place, you get no votes because you're behind the third candidate. So we can compute total votes for each candidate off of the ballots. These are, the first place votes, you just see them, first place votes, then you multiply them by 2. You find the second place votes for each candidate, multiply that by 1, it's the same thing. You add up the total votes, and then the runoff point at that point is to eliminate the candidate with the lowest total votes, in this case the Democrat. Once you eliminate the candidate and redistribute the ballots the way the instant runoff methodology does, you see that here the moderate GOP candidate like Matt Dolan beats the MAGA candidate, would also be the round robin winner. So, think about which system is most representative of the people of Ohio in terms of the overall. None of these candidates win an outright majority. Under any runoff system, if any candidate crosses 50% in terms of first place votes, they win the election. This is for what you do when no candidate has that outright upfront majority. MAGA has 40%. The Democrat originally, if we go back, had 40% of first place votes. Who should win the election? Okay, now here's where we're going to talk about history and how we got to where we got to and how we might want to improve for the future. So what I call round robin voting, the political scientists call Condorcet voting, after a French mathematician who lived in the 18th century who kind of invented the system and came up with this property called the Condorcet criterion, that the strongest candidate in a field of several candidates is the one who beats everybody else one-on-one. He worked at the same time in France with a guy named Borda, another French mathematician, who essentially invented what I call the total vote method. And the scientists call this a Borda count, but is operationally what I showed you as total votes. They hated each other because they each thought their own system was the best system. Interestingly enough, we have some evidence that our founders were vaguely aware, at least of Condorcet. I've seen references in letters that Madison and Jefferson wrote to some of their correspondents that they're aware of Condorcet's writing. I'm not 100% sure if they were also aware of Borda. I think it's fair to say that even though, again, our Constitution, our democracy comes out of Enlightenment thinking, right? We are a product of the Enlightenment. And it was an attempt to use the powers of reason. Madison comes from Montesquieu and Locke and the whole tradition of the Enlightenment. And I think the key intellectual point here is that the Enlightenment was going on simultaneously on both sides of the Atlantic as people were trying to use the powers of reason to improve the science of politics for the benefit of humanity and governance. And we got as far as we did on our side of the Atlantic with our developments, but there was things still developing over in France, and we didn't quite catch up with all of the latest developments. So the Constitution that we write and the project that we set forth for our country has these goals of designing a constitutional a republic that has government in the public interest. We want to avoid despotism and tyranny. We're going to use separation of powers and federalism to do that. A lot of architectural principles that hope will, achieve good government, but not as much attention to electoral systems. Madison, dabbles in electoral system design, but again, we're only voting in terms of the federal Constitution for the House, and Electoral College might not have any popular votes at all, as we talked about. The rules for House elections are actually left to the states, and the Constitution just piggybacks on what state law is going to do, which is why we can get state-based gerrymanders of congressional districts. And so our project is set in motion without the benefit of the best electoral science that was happening kind of right at the same time. And so one of the themes of today is that we need to recreate or reinvigorate our Madisonian system with some insights that evolved in parallel to the development of that system from the folks like Condorcet and Borda. So again, after we set our own project in motion, it kind of fell off the rails in some significant respects, right? I mean, the goal was to avoid the creations of, two-party antagonistic interests. Of course, that didn't happen. By the time, Madison reconciles himself to a version of a party system in his letters that he writes in 1792, and as he thinks about this over time in letters to friends as late as the 1820s. And so, he's hopeful that, and other people around him, that the kind of two-party system that we create is going to be consistent with majority wins. Like at least if, there is going to be this conflict, have the majority beat the minority and hope the checks and balances, separation of powers, bill of rights, and so forth will kind of protect us and protect the public interest from a tyranny of the majority. In many states, particularly in New England, they use runoffs to avoid plurality winner elections. Plurality means you get more votes than anybody else, but again, a plurality of 40% is not a majority of above 50%. And then eventually, by the time of the Jacksonian era, Andrew Jackson, around the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, we've largely, there's some stuff, I'm painting with a broad brush, we basically get rid of runoffs and use plurality elections. And, the hope is that in a world of two parties, that's going to be good enough, but certain pathologies develop. Again, we worry about party bosses. We create, in the progressive era, we create primaries to avoid bossism and machine politics. Once we move to primaries, the elites have a harder time to controlling nominations. And as we polarize the electorate going into the late 20th century and where we are today, how primaries interface with the November general election becomes complicated, as I just showed you with my New Hampshire example and so forth. So again, we need to kind of reinvigorate a Madisonian account in light of the new developments that have occurred and our new understanding of how to deal with it. Okay, some more history, before we wrap up. Because in some ways, I think this is the most relevant history for the choices that we need to make for ourselves and our posterity going forward. It turns out, kind of surprisingly, despite the fact that Madison and Jefferson were kind of vaguely aware of Condorcet and maybe Borda, that French political science got lost to the English-speaking world for the first half of the 20th century. I don't know whether it was the French Revolution, the fact that Condorcet got killed as part of the Reign of Terror, or what have you. But when in Britain, as British political scientists are trying to think through electoral reform, they don't reinvent Condorcet and Borda. They come up with a new system that they call the Hare system, which is what I showed you as instant runoff voting. So the originator of the instant runoff voting method is this guy, Thomas Hare, in Britain. John Stuart Mill loved it, tried to proselytize it. And in America, remember I mentioned William Ware. He was the one who was concerned about gerrymandering in the 1870s. He's the one who first in the United States says Hare has a method that we should use. So call it Hare, call it Ware, it's the same method. But interestingly, and we'll talk about this a little bit, they want to use it for legislative seats in a form of proportional representation. I'm not going to get into the math complexity on this. I've been looking at governor's races, Senate races that can't be gerrymandering. The reason why I showed you the picture of the original gerrymander and Ware's pamphlet where he wants to use the system is he thinks a version of the instant runoff system to apply to all the seats of a legislative assembly can give you a kind of proportional representation system that would avoid a gerrymander. So that's kind of the intellectual history of how that develops in the United States. It's not until an Australian named Edward Nansen rediscovers Condorcet and Borda that they get reintroduced into the English-speaking world. And there's a really nice piece about Nansen written by a Oxford political scientist named Ian MacLean, just talking about how almost like miraculous it was that, Nansen down in Melbourne, Australia in the 19th century, kind of on his own, discovers these things that had not been translated into English yet and says, wow, this is really important. And he actually, remember how Condorcet and Borda hated each other, and Nansen invents a system that actually combines the two that looks a little similar to that total vote runoff that I showed you. He's important for us in America because by the progressive era, we've got presentations in Congress as well as public discourse talking about what system would be good for the United States. So this guy, I want to focus on this guy, Clarence Hogue. You'll see this gets introduced in the congressional record by a Senator Owen from Oklahoma, who's a progressive in the progressive era. And notice the date, 1914. So we're right in the middle of the progressive era. And again, their main focus is proportional representation. His discussion of these systems that I've been focusing on is kind of like an aside, but in relationship to proportional representation as a whole. There's a renewed interest in this other topic of how you deal with single seat elections because of the presidential election of 1912. That's the three-way split between Wilson, the Democrat, incumbent Taft, an Ohioan, incumbent Republican president, and then Teddy Roosevelt, former president, had picked Taft to be his successor, didn't like the way Taft was going, wasn't progressive enough. Roosevelt bolts from the party convention, trying to recapture the Republican nomination in 1912, doesn't get it, forms the Bull Moose Progressive Third Party, and a three-way split. And so that kind of three-way split causes intellectuals and a lot of discourse. Well, how should we handle kind of three-way split? Similar to a little bit what I was showing you in the midterms. But TR's Progressive Party only lasts that one election because TR endorses the Republican Hughes in 1916. Again, there's not a lot of focus on reforming Senate elections because we just have them for the first time. And so let's not tinker with something brand new. But Hogan says, there are these three different systems to think about. One is the Ware system, which is instant runoff voting. Another system called the Buckland system is kind of it's kind of a crude attempt at something better that gets some play out west in Denver and other Colorado cities, but it's technically deficient. We could talk about that if you want to. But then Hoag says, or Hoag, however you pronounce it, says, Nancy, this guy from Australia, he's got the really good system because it's the only one compliant with the Condorcet principle of a true majority winner, the round robin winner in a three-way race. But, he says, look, let's just experiment. Any of these three would be better than plurality elections that we have. Let's just have an era of experimentation. We don't actually have that era. And again, I'm going to try to wrap up pretty quickly here and get some time for Q&A and discussion. Jack Santucci, a political scientist at Drexel University, has written a brand new book, Oxford University Press, that's fantastic, that goes through the failure of the progressive era to have this kind of reform have any sticking power. So quickly, what is that failure? Again, they focus on PR, not the real need for this in other types of elections. They're concerned about corruptions and machine bosses in cities. Even where Buckland voting, this kind of awkward system, gets used, they replace it because what they want is proportionally represented city councils that appoint city managers instead of elected mayors. Think of it like a mini parliamentary system where you vote for the parliament and the parliament appoints an executive. So they're not really thinking what's the best system for a governor's race or so forth. There's no serious effort to discuss that. There's no third party, and without a third party to push these reforms, hard to get them adopted. The whole ethos of anti-corruption is against parties to begin with. They're not trying to structure a system to have three parties. They're trying to go back to the Garden of Eden with no parties. Didn't happen after the founding, not going to happen after the progressive era. But once again, the reform mentality is to try to get rid of political parties rather than to kind of utilize them. Again, some of the reforms have particular defects. There was no real attempt to adopt the Borda-Condorcet-based Nansen method. That's not the focus of attention. And then finally, after FDR, after the New Deal, Great Depression, the labor movement thinks, hey, we can win and dominate in a two-party system. Why do we need a third party? All right, last sort of semi-historical point. For me, this is current affairs, but for many people, this is history. Right, we as a country lose interest in ranked choice voting for the most part between the progressive era and the year 2000. And it's Ralph Nader's role on the presidential ballot in 2000 and the fact that he siphons off votes likely from Gore makes a huge difference as, hey, maybe we should use that instant runoff method to avoid the spoiler problem. And so that's what gets us a lot of cities to start use it, San Francisco, Minneapolis, and so forth. And the question is, is it a good system for us today? The spoiler problem is different from the polarization problem, right? The spoiler effect is a candidate with a few votes like Ralph Nader, siphons votes, makes a difference in Bush versus Gore. The polarization problem is the problem of the hollowing out of the center of the electorate, which has happened over the last 50 years or so. And these graphs or charts from Pew really show just how much we're pulling apart. This is the comparison in 1994 to 2014, just a 20-year part of that total span of polarization. But even from 2014 to 2017, just look at how much further apart we are in 2017 than 2014. It's pretty dramatic. All right, to bring this up to date, I'm partnering with two social scientists. Both got their PhDs recently out at Stanford. One teaches in law school at Wisconsin, the other in the business school at Georgetown. And they have done computer simulations of 250,000 elections in each state. I mean, the computer just go, crazy over and over again, based on voter profiles of each state's electorate. So I'm just going to show you a couple of these as an example. In Arizona, we've got this what's called a bimodal distribution. This is the example in Arizona of this hollowing out of the middle. When you get voters on the left and voters on the right, but not as many voters in the center, there's some. The basic takeaway is this instant runoff methodology is going to replicate that polarization. Kind of like the examples I showed you in New Hampshire and Ohio, right? I mean, you're going to get winners on the right and the winners on the left. You're not going to get winners from the center. On the other hand, if you use a Condorcet-based system, whether the round-robin version or the total runoff version, you will find whatever candidate is closer to the center of the electorate, even if, in terms of the distribution, there are fewer voters in the middle. We saw that fewer voters for Morse, fewer voters for Matt Dolan. But the centrist candidate is still closest to the median voter because can pick up support from the left or the right. So in state after state, they can replicate this. Pennsylvania, bimodal distribution, instant runoff voting will replicate the polarization. Condorcet voting will ameliorate the polarization. Same thing here in Ohio. Even though Ohio is more right of center than Pennsylvania or Arizona, if we use instant runoff voting, we'll get that bimodal distribution. We use Condorcet voting, we'll find whoever is closer to the overall center of the electorate. We can repeat this again and again. All right. As a result of all this, my takeaway, and we can talk about details if you want to, is we need to think a new system based, again, on neo-Madisonian principles. We get candidates on a primary ballot. We utilize the role of political parties to do it. Independent candidates could be on the ballot as well. Use technology. The part of our electoral system that is most antiquated is signature gathering. It is 15th century, 16th century technology of, scrivener and parchment. We could make this a whole lot more rational if we wanted to. And then we could have a primary election that identifies two candidates to go to November, but utilize maybe, experimentation against some form of the Condorcet version to find candidates closer to the middle. We could have a hybrid, right? We could say, look, we want to use both the instant runoff method and the total vote method to get our top two finalists. We could do a whole lot more experimentation. We should think about reinvigorating the concept of fusion voting, where parties who don't make it to the final round can renominate and graft on to candidates who make it into the final round. I think we could do a lot more, again, to make our politics more representative. The question is whether we're going to do any of that. I think, states are going to have to experiment. The one thing that Congress could do would to have a baseline requirement, so one sentence statute to say anybody who wins a seat in Congress, unless we have proportional representation, ought to win a majority of votes in November. No plurality wins. That one-line rule would require states to do this experimentation because you couldn't allow a plurality winner election. We could talk about the details of that more if you want to. I've tried to advocate that both in scholarship and in the kind of op-ed writing that John mentioned that I do. But I think for all of us, the question is there any more likelihood that we can get these ideas to have salience? Are we going to repeat the lessons of the progressive era where all these ideas were discussed, the experimentation was called for? We were trying to introduce Condorcet and Borda through the Nansen method. That's the best method, but let's experiment. All of that was in the air, and then it withered. So can we know that history, learn that history, and then think about the founding era, the Madisonian project, simultaneous to this new science of voting from Condorcet and Borda, but doesn't get incorporated into the system, so it's left behind. It tries to come back in the progressive era, but it's anti-party, so it's left behind again. Are we finally at the stage where we can do that integration of these different strands of our project for the sake of the future? Thank you.
Okay, Willie. Let me throw a question out there. I was wondering what you thought about, but then we're going to open it up. So don't wander off. And we're also going to open it up to those who are in the Zoom too. But what about California? Where does California sit in your models? How would you the essentially wild race that goes off to two front runners?
Yeah, I heard it. Very important question. So two things. I should probably use the mic here again. Two things to say about California. The first is structurally, they use a version of the top two system now, where they have a nonpartisan primary. They have all Republicans, all Democrats, Independents, Greens, whoever. They're all on the same ballot. And part of what's crazy about that system, sometimes they have 30 candidates on the ballot for Senate or governor in that primary stage. And then they say, whoever the top two go to the November election. But it's this, again, crude plurality of winner top two. They don't use a sophisticated form of a ranked choice ballot to winnow the field and say, who are those two strongest that really deserve to go? So I think institutionally, we can learn something from California, but improve upon it. The other thing about California is there are some, I showed you the example of states that are highly polarized, having this bimodal distribution. There are other states in our 50-state system that don't look that way. Some on the left, some on the right. And California just happens to be a state that, because it's quite blue as a whole, yes, there's a spectrum, but that spectrum is more the traditional bell curve. And so a state that has a stronger center, wherever its center could be on the right or on the left, but wherever its own center is, the instant runoff system is likely to be better for that kind of state than for a state like Ohio or Arizona or Pennsylvania. So, for example, I could have shown you slides from North Dakota, has the same shape curve as California, even though much smaller state, and the North Dakota curve is located on the right end of the spectrum, but it's a more traditional curve. Interestingly enough, North Carolina happens to be a very competitive state that has a nice bell curve as opposed to the separate bimodal distribution. So how blue or red a state is the same as how polarized a state is.
Just real quick, how does the head-to-head system deal with strategic voting, where the weakest party could play that to their advantage to get if they know they're going to lose, they could make sure that the weakest candidate is the one that wins?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. It is the issue of strategic voting, and does it undermine the goals of an electoral system? And that could affect the so-called round robin or head-to-head approach, or the total vote approach. One of the things that I'm trying currently to work on with this mathematician, Eric Maskin, is to try to figure out, because there are some mathematical properties of the system that can tell you how vulnerable any system is to that kind of strategic manipulation. The good news is it really takes either side of the electorate to reach that 40% mark for strategic voting to be profitable. If one side or the other is below 40%, and in a three-way race, if, let's say, the right or the left is only at 35%, the two other components, the center and the opposite side, if they vote sincerely, that would be enough to defeat the strategic voting. So only if, you have to worry, if the right or the left gets to like that 45% threshold, that's where the kind of manipulation of the strategy could, cross over into a win. There's some properties that that are very technical that might insulate those systems from that Eric in particular is working on. One of the reasons why I'm attracted with the idea of experimentation and using this in the primary as opposed to the final round of the election like Alaska does is if the ranked choice ballot is only going to pick 2 finalists, that I think lowers the strategic temperature, right? Because you don't have to actually win the whole thing. You just have to make sure you're among the top 2. And it may be that combining some hybrid system where you have a component that is the regular instant runoff, like the hair-wear method, and then you have another component, gets a little more complicated, but if you have another component of the primary that is the more head-to-head method, again, you may be able to defeat some of that attempts to strategize by just opening up the system to more options at the primary level. But it is a crucial question that needs to be taken into account. Interestingly enough, this document by Hogue talks about this very issue and talks about one of the reasons why experimentation is important is just let's run a bunch of elections all around the country with these different systems and just see operationally how much of a problem this really is. Hogue says, I don't think the Nansen method is really that vulnerable. Sure, I can look mathematically and speculate the possibility that this might happen, but it's a risky strategy because if you try to, if you say, look, I'm not going to vote an honest second choice for the centrist candidate because I don't want the center to actually beat my preferred choice, so I'll try to defeat my second choice, you might, to use a technical term, screw up, and your strategy could backfire. And so even then they were sort of saying, hey, we just don't think it's that vulnerable in a real world setting. But we've never done that. For all the experimentation that was done in the progressive era, it was not this system. It was, the PR system in a different, we just went down a different avenue. We haven't really gone down this avenue before.
I would really want to know how your at-large system in Kentucky works. Are they kind of virtual districts, or are they literally at large across the state? How does that not replicate a senatorial election?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We could do a whole other talk on it, but just really briefly. Let's imagine a state that has 10 seats. And the first stage of the electoral process wouldn't be a primary the way we think of it now. Groups would identify themselves as, call them constituencies, call them communities of interest. They would say, please join our group. It could be political parties. So, like if it was in Ohio, it could be like Cleveland voters could say, hey, let's all stick together in Cleveland. We want a Cleveland district. But it could be farmers saying, farmers, we don't care where you are in the state, but we want a farm-based district. It could be, voters of color saying, hey, we want to protect ourselves from minority vote dilution. We want our own districts. So the first thing voters would do would vote for which group they want to be in and be represented by. And so then you would tally the votes that each group collects at that first stage, and you would apply the doctrine of one person, one vote to try to create equally populated districts. And if a group was oversubscribed, a group might have gotten enough votes for 2 districts or 3 districts or 4 districts, in which case at that point geography you'd have a map of the whole state, and there would be 4, let's say the 4 farmer districts, and you would have, in 4 different geographic districts, but that would be overlaid on the map. But then maybe the labor movement would have 3 districts, and it would be overlaid geographically, but only 3 different geographic districts within the farmer community, within the labor community. New Zealand actually does this, where they have different, they have just different sets of districts sitting on top of each other, depend on which community you join. So again, there would be some geographical. Now, if a group like the millennials who wanted to vote as a block only got enough for one district statewide, then the entire millennial district would look like the U.S. Senate district, but the only people in it would be this. So I think over time, and probably quite quickly, this would look like a form of proportional representation, because I think political parties would try to convince voters that they would have more clout if you voted as a party for party, so the Democratic Party would say, join the Democratic Party districts. And if there was 6 Democratic Party districts, you'd then subdivide geographically. And, there could be a MAGA, 4 MAGA districts or 4 GOP. So I think we would see it look like what Europe does as a proportional representation, where the first thing you do is you vote for your party. And the second stage of the electoral process is how the party subdivides its seats. Now, in Europe, it's not district-based at all. In this system, it would be, each group, party or other group, would get its determined number of seats, and then the particular seats would be awarded at the second stage of the process. And so it would be an inversion of what a primary looks like currently versus at the primary, you'd vote for your group. And let's say you voted into a Democratic district. In November, your vote would look more like what we think of as a primary, because you'd be in a district that would be thoroughly Democratic, and the only candidates vying would be ones who would win, who would want to represent Democrats. Yeah. Anyway, that's that system. So. The groups themselves. Sure. Yeah, probably won't get enough votes for districts, right? If you need to get. Yeah, so like, most congressional seats, and you could do this for state legislature, the numbers would be different, but most congressional seats, in the United States right now have roughly, 700 to 750,000 voters in them. So, so again, if a state is big enough for 10 districts, each district still needs to have, around, 700,000 voters. So, and if you don't reach that threshold, you don't get any district at all. So you probably want to define your group where you think you have a chance of crossing that threshold for at least one district. So, but I've talked to some students who have the Taylor Swift fans might have their own district, right? Because, we're all Taylor Swift fans, join us, right? I mean, that might be salient. And, who knows, in Ohio, your favorite college football star, we're all, we're Buckeye Nation. Join our district, right? Yeah. So, the Joe Biden wants this to reward South Carolina for the important role it played in his getting the nomination. Assuming Biden does run and has no challengers, this maneuver isn't going to make a difference, for 2024. The Republicans are not joining the plan, so it's only on the Democratic Party side. So the question is whether or not this reform sticks, for 2028, or if something unexpected happens and, Biden doesn't run or gets a chance. So I think we're going to have to wait a little while to know what its long-term significance is. I guess I would say what it signals to me most importantly is our electoral college system is not a rational system, because it was created and then recreated, as you pointed out, in 1803, but the way it gets actually implemented is through the state laws, and the state laws deviate from the design of either the original conception or the revised conception. So there is no human mind that created the system that we have, and yet we're stuck with it until we change it. And changing it is very hard, because if you're going to change it as a whole, you have to do a constitutional amendment. We've tried that, can't do it. Alex Kasar wrote a great book on why we still have the Electoral College, and we're kind of stuck with it. And changing it at the state level, is tricky, because every state has to think is it in our state's interest to make this unilateral change to our own state laws. And everything I just said isn't about the primaries, right? The Electoral College mechanism that's post-nominating convention is itself an unbelievably rube goal contraption. And then you layer on top of that the primary system, which is a product of party control and state laws that interrelate to the parties. And I would love a much more rational process. I don't know that it would start with South Carolina. I do think probably starting with South Carolina is better than starting with Iowa. But, if I can be the architect of a new system, I don't think it would be the system that the Democrats have come up with just for this year. But we don't have, it's unclear that Biden is even going to get his way for this year, because New Hampshire is still insisting we're the first, we're not going to agree to this. So I think there's going to be litigation over, who gets seated in the DNC convention. Is it according to the Biden plan, or is it according to New Hampshire state law? That could get to be ugly. Anyway, that's probably enough on that at the moment.
The big money.
The role of campaign finance. Well, it is a hugely important factor. I'm fortunate enough, the reason why I got to know Eric Maskin is he and I are members of a group of about 30 to 35 scholars who are trying to think of how the various institutional arrangements of electoral competition aggravate the problem of polarization and extremism. And there is a subset of that endeavor that is focused on campaign finance laws. I'm not part of that subgroup, but I kind of hear about it, and then we're going to try to integrate our various reports. The main message that I'm hearing from the campaign finance people is it depends on what you mean by big money, but if the concern is polarization and is extremism, technology has become our enemy a little bit, in the sense that, the big fundraisers in terms of intake are, AOC on the left and Marjorie Taylor Greene on the right. In other words, the more theologically out there you are, whichever side, you appeal for online small, it's not Koch brother money. It's ideological enthusiasts who are willing to give relatively small dollars to either the left or the right. And I actually think, my own take is that, combined with the gerrymandering, really is causing, problems in our, right? I think the House of Representatives in Congress and our own state house here in Ohio and elsewhere in the country is having governance problems because of gerrymandering and fundraising combined. And I think we need, because of Citizens United Supreme Court decision, we're not going to completely eliminate the fundraising problem. I think we have to eliminate the gerrymandering problem, whether through my self-districting idea or some other proportional representation scheme, or what have you. But the point I guess I want to make is that, and this ties back into the lessons learned from the progressive era. Like the progressive era, I should think we should be trying to think about proportional representation. But I think if we think about it exclusively, it won't work. It didn't work back then. I think we have to think about how to reform the House and the State House, but also how to reform the Senate the governor's mansion. I mean, and so I don't think that our era of reform, if it has any prayer of being successful, is going to be successful unless it tackles both gerrymandering and this other problem, whether you call it the primary problem because of the role of party primaries, or the set or squeeze problem, or the polarization problem. I think we have to tackle, both elements of what we're confronting today. And it may be oversimplistic to say the progressive era failed because it only tackled one of the two, but maybe there's some optimism that comes out of the fact that if we learn that lesson, at least tackle both simultaneously, we've got a better chance of success. And keep an eye on campaign finance, recognizing that there are limits to what we can do on that front because of citizens. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present these thoughts. And I as some of you know, this is an early stage. I mean, so I've done other work, but this is going to be the foundation for what I hope will be eventually a new book. And so if anybody has any thoughts, they can get in on the ground floor in terms of helping shape this project to fruition. So thank you.